The Story of the Hard Nut. Pirlipat's mother was the wife of a king, and therefore a queen, and Pirlipat straightway at the moment of her birth, a true princess. The king was beside himself with joy when he saw his beautiful daughter. She lay in the cradle. He shouted aloud, danced, jumped about upon one leg, and cried again and again, "Ha! Ha! Was there ever anything seen more beautiful than my little Pirlipat?" Thereupon all the ministers, generals, presidents, and staff officers jumped about upon one leg like the king and cried aloud, "No, never!" And it was so, in truth, for as long as the world has been standing, a lovelier child was never born than this very Princess Pirlipat. Her little face seemed made of lilies and roses, delicate white and red. Her eyes were of living, sparkling azure, and it was charming to see how her little locks curled in bright golden ringlets. Besides this, Pirlipat had brought into the world 2 rows of little pearly teeth, with which 2 hours after her birth she bit the High Chancellor's finger as he was examining her features too closely, so that he screamed out, "Oh, Yemine!" Others assert that he screamed out, "Oh, crikey!" But on this point authorities are at the present day divided. Well, little Pirlipat bit the High Chancellor's finger, and the enraptured land knew now that some sense dwelt in Pirlipat's beautiful body. As has been said, all were delighted. The queen alone was very anxious and uneasy, and no one knew wherefore. But everybody remarked with surprise the care with which she watched Pirlipat's cradle. Beside that, the doors were guarded by soldiers, and not counting the 2 nurses, who always remained close by the cradle, 6 maids, night after night, sat in the room to watch. But what seemed very foolish, and no one could understand the meaning of it, was this. Each of these 6 maids must have a cat upon her lap and stroke it the whole night through, and thus keep it continually purring. It is impossible that you, dear children, can guess why Pirlipat's mother made these arrangements, but I know, and I will straightway tell you. It happened that once upon a time many great kings and fine princes were assembled at the court of Pirlipat's father, on which occasion much splendor was displayed. The theatres were crowded, balls were given, and tournaments held almost every day. The king, in order to show plainly that he was in no want of gold and silver, was resolved to take a good handful out of his royal treasury and expend it in a suitable manner. Therefore, as soon as he had been privately informed by the overseer of the kitchen that the court astronomer had predicted the right time for killing, he ordered a great feast of sausages, leapt into his carriage, and went himself to invite the assembled kings and princes to take a little soup with him, in order to enjoy the agreeable surprise which he had prepared for them. Upon his return, he said very affectionately to the queen, "You know, my dear, how extremely fond I am of sausages." The queen knew at once what he meant by that, and it was this, that she should take upon herself, as she had often done before, the useful occupation of making sausages. The Lord Treasurer must straightway bring to the kitchen the great golden sausage kettle and the silver chopping knives and stew pans. A large fire of sandalwood was made. The Queen put on her damask apron, and soon the sweet smell of the sausage meat began to steam up out of the kettle. The agreeable odour penetrated even to the royal council chamber, and the king, seized with a sudden transport, could no longer restrain himself. "With your permission, my lords," he cried, and leapt up, ran as fast as he could into the kitchen, embraced the Queen, stirred a little with his golden sceptre in the kettle, and then, his emotion being quieted, returned calmly to the council. The important moment had now arrived when the fat was to be chopped into little pieces and browned gently in the silver stew pans. The maids of honor now retired, for the Queen, out of true devotion and reverence for her royal spouse, wished to perform this duty alone. But just as the fat began to fry, a small, whispering voice was heard. "Give me a little of the fat, sister. I should like my part of the feast. I too am a queen. Give me a little of the fat." The Queen knew very well that it was Lady Mouserings who said this. Lady Mouserings had lived these many years in the king's palace. She maintained that she was related to the royal family, and that she was herself a queen in the kingdom of Mausolia, for which reason she held a great court under the hearth. The Queen was a kind and benevolent lady, and although she was not exactly willing to acknowledge Lady Mouserings as a true queen and sister, yet she was very ready to allow her a little banquet on this great holiday. She answered, therefore, "Come out then, Lady Mouserings. You are welcome to a little of the fat." Upon this, Lady Mouserings leapt out very quickly and merrily jumped upon the hearth, and seized with her dainty little paws one piece of fat after the other as the Queen reached it to her. But now all the cousins and aunts of the Lady Mouserings came running out, besides her 7 sons, rude and forward rogues, who all fell at once upon the fat, and the terrified Queen could not drive them away. But as good fortune would have it, the chief maid of honor came in at this moment and chased away the intruding guests, so that a little of the fat was left. The king's mathematician, being summoned, demonstrated very clearly that there was enough remaining to season all the sausages if distributed with the nicest judgment and skill. Drums and trumpets were now heard without, and all the invited potentates and princes, some on white palfreys, some in crystal carriages, came in splendid apparel to the sausage feast. The king received them kindly and graciously, and then, adorned with crown and sceptre, as became the monarch of the land, seated himself at the head of the table. Already in the first course, that of the sausage balls, it was observed that he grew pale and paler, raised his eyes to heaven, gentle sighs escaped from his bosom, and he seemed to undergo great inward suffering. But in the second course, which consisted of the long sausages, he sank back upon his throne, sobbing and moaning, held both hands to his face, and at last wept and groaned aloud. All sprang up from the table. The royal physician tried in vain to feel the pulse of the unhappy monarch, a deep-seated, unknown torture appeared to agitate him. At last, after much anxiety, and after the application of some very strong remedies, the king seemed to come a little to himself, and stammered out, scarce audibly, the words, "Too little fat." Then the queen threw herself in despair at his feet and sobbed out, "Oh, my poor unhappy royal husband! Alas, how great must be the suffering which you endure! But see the guilty one at your feet. Punish her without mercy. Alas, Lady Mouserings with her 7 sons and aunts and cousins have eaten up the fat and—" With these words she fell right over backwards in a swoon. Then the king, full of rage, leapt up and cried out, "Chief maid of honor, how happened that?" The chief maid of honor told the story as much as she knew of it, and the king resolved to take vengeance upon Lady Mouserings and her family for having eaten up the fat of his sausages. The Privy Council was called, and it was resolved to summon Lady Mouserings to trial and confiscate all her estates. But as the king was of opinion that in the meanwhile she might eat up more of his sausage fat, the affair was placed at last in the hands of the royal watchmaker and mechanist. This man, whose name was the same as mine, to wit, Christian Elias Drosselmeyer, engaged by means of a very singular and deep political scheme to drive Lady Mouserings and her family from the palace forever. He invented, therefore, several curious little machines in which a piece of toasted fat was fastened to a thread, and these Drosselmeyer placed around Lady Mousering's dwelling. Lady Mouserings was much too wise not to see through Drosselmeyer's craft, but all her warnings, all her entreaties were of no avail. Every one of her 7 sons and many of her cousins and aunts went into Drosselmeyer's machines, and, as they tried to snap away at the fat, were caught by an iron grating which fell suddenly down behind them. Lady Mouserings, with the little remnant of her family, forsook the dreadful place. Grief, despair, revenge filled her bosom. The court revelled in joy at this event, but the queen was very anxious, for she knew the disposition of Lady Mouserings, and was very sure that she would not suffer the death of her sons to go unavenged. In fact, Lady Mouserings appeared one day when the queen was in the kitchen preparing a horselet hash for her royal husband, a dish of which he was very fond, and said, "My sons, my cousins and aunts are destroyed. Take care, queen. The mouse queen does not bite thy little princess in two. Take good care." With this she disappeared and was not seen again, but the queen was so frightened that she let the hash fall into the fire, and thus a second time Lady Mouserings spoiled a favourite dish for the king, at which he was very angry. "But this, dear children," said Drosselmeyer, "is enough for tonight. The rest at another time." Maria, who had her own thoughts about the story, begged Godfather Drosselmeyer very hard to go on, but she could not prevail upon him. He rose, saying, "Too much at once is bad for the health. The rest tomorrow." As the councillor was just stepping out of the room, Fred called out, "Tell me, Godfather Drosselmeyer, is it then really true that you invented mouse traps?" How can you ask such a silly question? Said his mother. But the counselor smiled mysteriously and said in an undertone, Am I a skillful watchmaker, and yet not able to invent a mousetrap? The story of the hard nut continued. You know now, children, commenced Councillor Drosselmeyer on the following evening, why the Queen took such care in guarding the beautiful Princess Pirlipat. Was it not to be feared that Lady Mauserings would execute her threat, that she would come again and bite the little princess to death? Drosselmeyer's machines were not the least protection against the wise and prudent Lady Mauserings, but the court astronomer, who was at the same time private stargazer and fortune-teller to His Majesty, declared it to be his opinion that the family of Baron Purr would be able to keep Lady Mauserings from the cradle. Most of the name were secretaries of legation at court, with little to do, though always at hand for an embassy to a foreign power, but they must now render themselves useful at home. And thus it came that each of the waiting women must hold a son of that family upon her lap, and by continual and attentive fondling lighten the severe public duties which fell to their lot. Late one night the two chief nurses, who sat close by the cradle, started up out of a deep sleep. All around lay in quiet slumber, no purring, the stillness of the grave. Even the death watch could be heard ticking. And what was the terror of the two chief waiting women as they just saw before them a large, dreadful mouse, which stood erect upon its hind legs and had laid its ugly head close against the face of the princess. With a cry of terror, they jumped up, all awoke, but in a moment Lady Mauserings, for the great mouse by Pirlipat's cradle was no one but she, ran as fast as she could to the corner of the chamber. The secretaries of legation leapt after her, but too late. She had disappeared through a hole in the chamber floor. Little Pirlipat awoke at the noise and wept bitterly. "Ah, thank heavens!" cried the nurse. "She lives! She lives!" But how great was their terror when they looked at Pirlipat and saw what a change had taken place in the sweet, beautiful child. Instead of the white and red face with golden locks, a large, ill-shapen head sat upon her thin, shriveled body. Her azure-blue eyes were changed into green, staring ones, and her little mouth had stretched itself from ear to ear. The Queen was brought to death's door by grief and sorrow, and it was found necessary to hang the king's library with thick wadded tapestry, for again and again he ran his head against the wall, crying out at every time in lamentable tone, "Ah, me, unhappy monarch!" He might now have seen how much better it would have been to eat his sausages without fat, and to leave Lady Mauserings and her family at peace under the hearth. But Pirlipat's royal father did not think about this. He laid all the blame upon the court watchmaker and mechanist, Christian Elias Drosselmeyer of Nuremberg. He therefore wisely decreed that Drosselmeyer should restore the Princess Pirlipat to her former condition within 4 weeks, or at least find out some certain and infallible method of effecting this Otherwise he should suffer a shameful death under the axe of the executioner. Drosselmeyer was a little terrified, but he had great confidence in his skill and good fortune, and began immediately the first operation which he thought useful. He took little Princess Pirlipat apart with great dexterity, unscrewed her little hands and feet, and carefully examined her inward structure. But he found, alas, that the princess would grow uglier as she grew bigger, and knew not what to do or what to advise. He put the princess carefully together again and sank down by her cradle in despair, for he was not allowed to leave it. The 4th week had commenced. Yes, Wednesday had come, when the king looked in with flashing eyes and, shaking a scepter at him, cried, "Christian Elias Drosselmeyer, cure the princess, or thou must die." Drosselmeyer began to weep bitterly, but the Princess Pirlipat lay as happy as the day, and cracked nuts. Pirlipat's uncommon appetite for nuts now occurred for the first time to the mechanist, and the fact likewise that she had come into the world with teeth. In truth, immediately after her transformation, she had screamed continually until a nut accidentally came in her way, which she immediately put in her mouth, cracked it, ate the kernel, and then became quite composed. Since that time, the nurses found that nothing pleased her so well as to be supplied with nuts. Oh, sacred instinct of nature, eternal, inexplicable sympathy of existence, cried Christian Elias Drosselmeyer. Thou pointest me to the gates of this mystery. I will knock, and they will open. He begged straightway for permission to speak with the royal astronomer, and was led to his apartments under a strong guard. They embraced with many tears, for they had been warm friends, then retired into a private cabinet and examined a great many books which treated of instinct, of sympathies, of antipathies, and other mysterious things. Night came on. The astronomer looked at the stars, and with the aid of Drosselmeyer, who had great skill in such matters, set up the horoscope of Princess Pirlipat. It was a great deal of trouble, for the lines grew all the while more and more intricate, but at last, what joy! At last it became clear that the Princess Pirlipat, in order to be freed from the magic which had deformed her, and to regain her beauty, had nothing to do but to eat the kernel of the nut Krakatuk. Now the nut Krakatuk had such a hard shell that an 84-pounder might be wheeled over it without breaking it. This hard nut must be cracked with the teeth before the princess by a man who had never been shaven and had never worn boots. The young man must then hand her the kernel with closed eyes, and must not open them again until he had marched 7 steps backwards without stumbling. Drosselmeyer and the astronomer had labored together without cessation for 3 days and nights, and the king was seated at dinner on Sunday afternoon, when the machinist, who was to have been beheaded early Monday morning, rushed in with joy and transport, and proclaimed that he had found out a method of restoring to the Princess Pirlipat her lost beauty. The king embraced him with great kindness, and promised him a diamond sword, 4 orders of honor, and 2 new Sunday suits. Immediately after dinner we will go to work, he added. and see to it, dear mechanist, that the unshorn young man in shoes is ready at hand with the Nutcracker, and take care that he drinks no wine beforehand, for fear he should stumble as he goes the 7 steps backwards like a crab. Afterward he may drink like a fish. Drosselmeier was very much discomposed at these words, and after much stuttering and stammering said that the method was discovered indeed, but that the Nutcracker and the young man to crack it were yet to be sought after, that it was quite doubtful whether nut or Nutcracker would ever be found. The king, in great anger, swung his scepter about his crowned head, and roared with the voice of a lion, "Then off goes thy head!" It was very fortunate for the unhappy Drosselmeier that the king's dinner had been cooked better than usual this day, so that he was in a pleasant humour and disposed to listen to reason, while the good queen, who was moved by the hard fate of the mechanist, used her influence to soothe him. Drosselmeier then, after a while, took courage and represented to the monarch that he had performed his task in discovering the means to restore the princess to her beauty, and thus by the terms of the royal decree had secured his safety. The king said that was all trash, stupid stuff and nonsense, but resolved at last that the watchmaker should leave the court instantly, accompanied by the royal astronomer, and never return without the Nutcracker in his pocket. By the intercession of the queen, he consented that the Nutcracker might be summoned by a notice in all the home and foreign newspapers and journals. Here the counsellor broke off again, and promised to narrate the rest on the following evening. Conclusion of the story of the hard nut. The next evening, as soon as the candles were lighted, Godfather Drosselmeier appeared and continued his story as follows. Drosselmeier and the astronomer had been 15 years on their journey without seeing the least signs of the Nutcracker. It would take me a month, children, to tell where they went and what strange things happened to them. I must pass them over and commence where Drosselmeier sank at last into despondency and felt a great desire to see his dear native city, Nuremberg. This desire came upon him all at once as he was smoking a pipe of tobacco with his friend in the middle of a great wood in Asia. "Oh, sweet city," he cried. "Sweet native city, sweet Nuremberg. He who has never seen thee, though he may have travelled to London, Paris, Rome, if his heart is not dead to emotion, must continually desire to visit thee, O Nuremberg, sweet city, where there are so many beautiful houses with windows." As Drosselmeier grieved in such a sorrowful manner, the astronomer was moved with sympathy and began to cry and howl so pitifully that it was heard far and wide through Asia. He soon composed himself again, wiped the tears out of his eyes, and said, But why, my respected colleague, why sit here and howl? Why should we not go to Nuremberg? Is it not all the same wherever we seek after this miserable Nutcracker? "That is true," replied Drosselmeier. Greatly consoled, both rose, knocked out their pipes and went straight forward out of the wood in the middle of Asia, right to Nürnberg. They had scarcely arrived there when Drosselmeyer ran to his brother, Christopher Zacharias Drosselmeyer, puppet maker, varnisher and gilder, whom he had not seen for these many years. The watchmaker told him the whole story of the Princess Pirlipat, Lady Mauserings, and the Nutcracker, so that he struck his hands together over and over again with astonishment and exclaimed, "Aye, aye, brother, brother, what strange things are these?" Drosselmeyer then related the history of his travels, how he had passed 2 years with King Dade, how coldly he had been received by Prince Almond, and how he had sought information to no purpose of the natural society of Squirrelberg. In short, how his search everywhere had been in vain to find even the least signs of the Nutcracker. During this account, Christopher Zacharias had often snapped his fingers, turned about on one foot, winked, laughed, clucked with his tongue, and then called out, "He, I, oh," if it should. At last, he tossed his hat and wig up in the air, clasped his brother round the neck, and cried, "Brother, brother, you are safe, safe, I say, for I must be wonderfully mistaken if I have not that Nutcracker at this very moment in my possession." He then drew a little box from his pocket and took out of it a gilded nut of moderate size. "See," he said, "this nut fell into my hands in this way. Many years ago, a stranger came here at Christmas time with a sack full of nuts, which he offered for sale cheap. Just as he passed my shop, he got into a quarrel with a nut seller of the city, who did not like to see a stranger come hither to undersell him, and for this reason attacked him. The man put down his sack upon the ground, the better to defend himself, and at the same moment a heavily laden wagon passed directly over it. All the nuts were cracked in pieces except this one, which the stranger, with a singular smile, offered me for a bright dollar of the year 1720. I thought that strange, but as I found in my pocket just such a dollar as the man wanted, I bought the nut and gilded it over, not knowing why I bought the nut so dear, or why I set so much store by it. All doubt whether this nut was actually the long-sought nut Krakatuk was initially removed when the astronomer was called, who carefully scraped off the gold and found upon the rind the word Krakatuk, engraved in Chinese characters. The joy of the travellers was beyond bounds, and the brother the happiest man under the sun, for Drosselmeyer assured him that his fortune was made, since he would have a considerable pension for the rest of his days, and then there was the gold which had been scraped off he might keep for the gilding. The mechanist and the astronomer had both put on their nightcaps and were getting into bed as the latter commenced. "My worthy colleague, good fortune never comes single. Take my word for it. We have found not only the Nutcracker, but also the young man who is to crack it, and hand the kernel to the princess. Nobody else than your brother's son. I cannot sleep. No, this very night I must cast the youth's horoscope." With these words, he threw the nightcap off his head and began straightway to take an observation. The brother's son was in truth a handsome, well-grown young man who had never been shaven and who had never worn boots. In his early youth, he had on Christmas nights gone around as a merry andrew, but this could not be seen in his behavior in the least, so well had his manners been formed by his father's care. On Christmas days, he wore a handsome red coat trimmed with gold, a sword, a hat under his arm, and a curling wig. In this fine dress he would stand in his father's shop and out of gallantry crack nuts for the young girls, for which reason he was called the handsome Nutcracker. On the following morning the astronomer was in raptures. He fell upon the machinist's neck and cried, "It is he! We have him! He is found! But there are two things, worthy colleague, which we must see to. In the first place, we must braid for your excellent nephew a stout wooden queue, which shall be joined in such a way to his lower jaw that it can move it with great force. In the next place, when we arrive at the king's palace, we must let no one know that we have brought the young man with us who is to crack the nut, Krakatuk. It is best that he should not be found for a long time." I read in his horoscope that after many young men have broken their teeth to no purpose, the king will promise to him who cracks the nut and restore the princess her lost beauty, the princess herself, and the succession to the throne as a reward. His brother, the puppet maker, was highly delighted to think that his son might marry the Princess Pirlipat and become a prince and king, and he gave him up entirely into the hands of the two travelers. The queue which Drosselmeyer fastened upon his young and hopeful nephew answered admirably, so that he made a series of the most successful experiments even upon the hardest peach stones. As Drosselmeyer and the astronomer had sent immediate information to the palace of the discovery of the nut, Krakatuk, suitable notices had been published, and when the travellers arrived, many handsome young men, and among them some handsome princes, had appeared, who, trusting to their sound teeth, were ready to undertake the disenchantment of the princess. The travellers were not a little terrified when they beheld the princess again. Her little body, with its tiny hands and feet, was hardly able to carry her great misshapen head, and the ugliness of her face was increased by a white cotton beard, which had spread itself around her mouth and over her chin. All happened as the astronomer had read in the horoscope. One youth in shoes after another bit upon the nut Krakatuk until his teeth and jaws were sore, and as he was led away half swooning by the physicians in attendance, sighed out, "That was a hard nut," when the king, in the anguish of his heart, had promised his daughter and his kingdom to him who should effect the disenchantment. The handsome young Drosselmeyer stepped forward and begged for permission to begin the experiment. And no one had pleased the fancy of Princess Pirlipat as well as young Drosselmeyer. She laid her little hand upon her heart and sighed deeply. "Ah, if this might be the one who is to crack the nut, Krakatuk, and become my husband." After young Drosselmeyer had gracefully saluted the king and queen and then the Princess Pirlipat, he received the Nutcracker from the hands of the master of ceremonies, put it without hesitation between his teeth, pulled his cue very hard, and crack, crack, the shell broke into many pieces. He then nicely removed the little threads and broken bits of shell that hung to the kernel, and reached it with a low bow to the princess, after which he shut his eyes and began to walk backwards. The princess straightway swallowed the kernel, and behold, her ugly shape was gone, and in its place appeared a most beautiful figure, with a face of roses and lilies, delicate white and red, eyes of living, sparkling azure, and locks curling in bright golden ringlets. Drums and trumpets mingled their sound with the loud rejoicing of the people. The king and his whole court danced, as at Pirlipat's birth, upon one leg, and the queen had to be carefully tended with cologne water, because she had fallen into a swoon from delight and rapture. Young Drosselmeyer, who had still his 7 steps to perform, was a good deal discomposed by the tumult, but he kept firm, and was just stretching back his right foot for the 7th step, when Lady Mouserings rose, squeaking and squealing out of the floor. Down came his foot upon her head, and he stumbled, so that he hardly kept himself from falling. Alas, what a hard fate! As quick as thought, the youth was changed in the former figure of the princess. His body became shriveled up, and was hardly able to support his great misshapen head. His eyes turned green and staring, and his mouth was stretched from ear to ear. Instead of his queue, a narrow wooden cloak hung down upon his back, with which he moved his lower jaw. The watchmaker and astronomer were benumbed with terror and affright, while Lady Mouserings rolled bleeding and kicking upon the floor. Her malice did not go unpunished, for young Drosselmeyer had trodden upon her neck so heavily with the sharp heel of his shoe that she could not survive. When Lady Mouserings lay in her last agonies, she squeaked and whimpered in a piteous tone. "Oh, Krakatuk, hard nut, he, of thee I now must die. Quee, quee, sun with 7 crowns will bite, Nutcracker at night, he, quee, quee, and revenge his mother's death. Short breath must I, he, die, so young, quee, quee, oh agony, quee." With this cry, Lady Mouserings died, and the royal oven heater carried out her body. As the young Drosselmeyer, no one troubled himself any farther about him, but the princess put the king in mind of his promise, and he commanded that they should bring the young hero before him. But when the unfortunate youth approached, the princess held both hands before her face and cried, "Away, away with the ugly Nutcracker!" The court-martial immediately took him by the shoulders and pushed him out of the doors. The king was full of anger because they had wished to give him a Nutcracker for a son-in-law, and he put all the blame upon the mechanist and astronomer, and banished them forever from the kingdom. This did not stand in the horoscope which the astronomer had set up at Nuremberg. But he did not allow himself to be discouraged. He straightway took another observation and declared that he could read in the stars that young Drosselmeyer could conduct himself so well in his new station that in spite of his deformity he would yet become a prince and a king, and that his former beauty would return as soon as the son of Lady Mauserings, who had been born with 7 heads, after the death of her 7 sons, had fallen by his hand, and a maiden had loved him, notwithstanding his ugly shape. And they say that young Drosselmeyer has actually been seen about Christmas time in his father's shop at Nuremberg, as a nutcracker, it is true, but at the same time as a prince. This, children, is the story of the hard nut. And you know now why people say so often, "That was a hard nut," and whence it comes that nutcrackers are so ugly. The counselor thus concluded his narration. Maria thought that the Princess Pirlipat was an ill-natured, ungrateful thing, and Fred declared that if Nutcracker were anything of a man, he would not be long in settling matters with the Mouse King, and would get his old shape again very soon.